Hi guys, this is Mr. Tan, and today we're looking at international business and globalization. We are in week 2 and PowerPoint slides 2, and we're going to be looking at either trade enhancements or trade restrictions and why countries may use either or to either enhance or restrict free movement of goods and exports and imports between countries. So the diagram here shows, institutional factors that are affecting the flow of goods and services, and it shows that a country could either use trade enhancements or trade restrictions, which would then affect companies' competitive environment. And this would depend upon, the different countries' cultural values, attitudes and beliefs, and their political policies and legal practices if it's consistent with country B, as well as various economic forces and the impact that those economic forces may have on their own countries by allowing free trade with other countries. So these are the things that would determine whether a country adopts either trade enhancements or trade restrictions. So what are some of the rationales for trade restrictions? Some of the rationales for trade restrictions includes to fight unemployment, to protect infant industries, to develop an industrial base and economic relationships with other countries whereby you may not want to then do business with another country. If we're looking at the fight for unemployment, often goods from abroad are cheaper because they offer cheaper capital and labor costs. So when you have more imported goods coming in, you have increased competition. And if you have increased competition within the market forces, your own industries may then have to close because they may not be able to compete with a competitive advantage another company may have, because we looked at Porter's diamond model, for example. And and then, or even if you can compete, you may not have to. You may have to look at your costs and your gross and net profit. So you may have to lay off workers. You may have to cut shift patterns. So employees don't get as much work, which could lead to higher unemployment rates and therefore more money going out from the government to pay those people on unemployment benefits, and a less happier electorate as well. If we're looking at the infant industries, well, you may want to give the infant industries in your own country more time to develop. The infant industry argument says that production becomes more competitive over time because of the increased economies of scale and greater worker efficiency, and then you know how to implement various policies, procedures and processes like total quality management, Kaizen type practices, just-in-time management principles. But as an infant industry, you may not be implementing these, straight away. If we're talking about to develop an industrial base, well, since the Industrial Revolution, countries, increasing their industrial base, grew their employment and economies very rapidly. This observation led to protectionist arguments to spur local industrialization. These arguments have been, based on the following assumptions. Surplus workers can increase manufacturing output more easily than, agricultural output. Import restrictions lead to foreign investment inflows, which provide jobs in manufacturing. Prices and sales in agricultural products and raw materials, fluctuate widely, which a determinant to economics that depends heavily on them, especially if the dependence on them is one or a few commodities. And also, markets for industrial products grow faster than markets for both agricultural and raw materials commodities. So, if we are looking at the economic relationships with other countries, well, nations monitor the absolute economic situations and compare their performance to other countries. Among their practice to improve their relative positions, four stand out. Making balance of trade adjustments, gaining comparable access to foreign markets, and using restrictions as a bargaining tool, and controlling prices. So again, these are all kind of arguments for economic relationships with other countries. And even if we look at the USA and President Trump's 2016, presidential campaign, which was highly critical of free trade. In 2018, the Trump administration introduced billions of dollars in new tariffs on China. So why governments intervene in trade? Again, we've got the economic rationales in fighting unemployment, fighting protection industries, protecting industrialization and improving comparative positions from looking at the positions of your country in relation to others from a worldwide perspective. And then you have the non-economic rationales, including maintaining essential industries, promoting acceptable practices abroad, maintaining and extending spheres of influence, and preserving national culture. So you have both economic rationales and non-economic rationales as regards to why government may intervene and adopt, restricted practices in trade agreements. So if we look at the non-economic rationale for trade restrictions, well, these are going to include, to maintaining essential industries, especially defence, not dependent on foreign surpluses, during hostile political periods. They include promoting acceptable practices abroad. Governments limit exports, even to friendly countries or strategic goods that might fall into the hands of potential enemies. They also limit exports and imports to compel a foreign country to change its, objectives in terms of policy or capability. The rationale here is to weaken the foreign country's economy by decreasing its foreign sales and by limiting its access to needed products, thus coercing them to amend its practices on some issues such as human rights, environmental protection, military activities, and production of harmful products. And another rationale is to maintain or extend spheres of influence. Governments may use trade support, their spheres of influence, giving aid and credits to and encouraging imports from countries that join a political alliance or vote a preferred way, with international bodies. And then we have to preserve national culture. Well, to help sustain a collective identity that sets their citizens apart from other nationalities, governments prohibit exports of art and historical items deemed to be part of their national heritage. In addition, they may limit imports that may either conflict with or replace, their dominant values. When we look at the instruments of tariff trade controls, tariffs, these include tariffs, duty, and why are these tariffs levied, and different types of tariffs. Tariff barriers directly affect prices, and non-tariff barriers may directly affect either their price or their quantity. A tariff, also called a duty, is a tax levied on a good shipped internationally. That is, governments charge a tariff on a good when it crosses an official boundary, whether it is to be, of a nation or a group of nations that have agreed to impose a common tariff on goods crossing a boundary within their bloc. Tariffs may be levied on goods entering, leaving, or passing through a country for protection for revenue, on a per unit basis, a value basis, or both. So, a tariff, assessed on a per unit basis is a specific duty on a percentage of the item's value, and on both, a compound duty. Instruments of trade control, non-tariffs, subsidies. Subsidies offer direct assistance to companies to boost their competitiveness. Although this definition is not really straightforward, and there's lots of disagreements on what constitutes a subsidy. In essence, governmental subsidies may help companies to become more competitive because they've got more revenue in another country where they may not be as competitive price wise. But there is little agreement on what is a subsidy. Agriculture subsidies are difficult to dismantle, especially to overcome market imperfections, because they are at least very controversial. The one area in which everyone argues that subsidies exist is agriculture, especially in developed countries. This official reason is that food supplies is too critical to be left to chance. Although subsidies, lead to surplus production, they are argued to be preferable to the risk of food shortages. When we think about the instruments of trade control, non-tariffs, these will include, aids and loans. When governments require foreign aid and loan recipients to spend the funds in a donor country, a situation which is known as a tied aid or tied loans. Some otherwise, non-competitive output can now compete abroad with these foreign aids or tied loans or tied aids. For instance, tied aid helps with large contracts for infrastructure such as telecommunications, railway and electric power projects. When we look at quotas, a quota limits the quantity of a product that can be imported or exported in a given time frame, typically a year. So import quotas normally, raise the prices because they, one, limit supplies, and they provide little incentive to use price competition to increase sales. So a specific type of quota that prohibits all trade, you may have heard of in the news, is called an embargo. And as with quotas, a country or group of countries may place embargoes on either imports or exports on particular products, regardless of origin or destination, on a specific products with certain countries, or on all products with given countries. We have buy local legislation, which sets out rules whereby governments give preference to domestic production, in their purchases. And then we have instruments of trade control in terms of the service industries. And, there are four factors to consider. The service industry itself is a fast-growing sector in international trade. In deciding whether to restrict service trade, countries typically consider four types of factors: essentiality, not-for-profit services, standards, and immigration. If we're talking about essentiality, governments sometimes prohibit private companies, foreign or domestic, from operating in some sectors because they feel that the services are essential and provide social stability. In other cases, they set price controls or subsidize governments' own service organizations that create, disincentives for foreign private participation for some essential services in which foreign firms, might be excluded, including the media, communications, banking, utilities, and domestic transport. If we look at the not-for-profit services, mail, education, and hospital health services are often not-for-profit services in which few foreign firms compete. When a government privatizes these industries, it customarily prefers local ownership and control. Lucky, what are you doing, babe? Okay. I'm videoing. Did you ate it though? Yeah, it was too late. I'd eaten a lot before that. Standards, some services require face-to-face interaction between, professionals and clients, and governments limit entry into many of them to ensure practices, by qualified personnel. The licensing requirements include such professionals as accountants, architects, electricians, engineers, hairstylists, lawyers, medical personnel, real estate brokers, and teachers. So again, maintaining those standards, to ensure that the right people have the right standards who are coming in into those industry sectors. And also immigration, satisfying the standards of a particular country is no guarantee that a foreigner can then work there. In addition, government regulations, often require that an organization, domestic or foreign, to search extensively for qualified personnel locally before they go and even apply for work permits for personnel that they would like to bring in from another country. So today, guys, we've looked at either trade enhancements or trade restrictions, and we've looked at the reasons in different market sectors as regards to why, governments may either go for trade enhancements or trade restrictions. So it's not all